It was a horrendous sight because you had bodies and extraordinarily sort of macabre scene of dented and blood-stained instruments.
It does make you stop and think, I'm alive today and I hope I'm alive tomorrow and something doesn't happen to me, I must admit.
I don't think about it, except I know what goes on whenever I hear that a large train crash has occurred. I can picture what's going on.
Once you've smelt it, you can go anywhere in the world, and if you smell that smell, you'll know that it's got to do with death.
Tragedy and inferno, London has seen it all. And the police photographer sees it first. Raw and ragged anguish in close-up and sharp focus. In pictures never before made public from the archive of the Metropolitan Police Photographic Branch. It was rush hour when 3 commuter trains collided in the steep railway cutting outside Clapham Junction, Britain's busiest station. 35 people were to lose their lives that mid-December day in 1988. Clapham was to start the angry debate about the standard of rail safety. For one of the photographic branch's 30 cameramen, Alan Parker, it was just another job.
I did get a call. Would I go down to the Clapham scene? I suppose I got a call about 8:30 in the morning. When I got there, it was a scene of, quite bad carnage. A train had run into the back of another one, careered alongside it and met another one coming head on, so there was absolute mayhem.
But the police photographer's job is to make order out of the mayhem, define disaster, catalogue the chaos.
You have to ask, first of all, from the major incident officer whether you can go into the scene. You wear a jacket which shows that you're a major incident person, so you've now got permission to go into the scene. But whilst there are people beavering away there to try and get people out who are trapped and injured, you feel a right nana. You feel as though you shouldn't be there. At least I did. I felt as though I shouldn't be there.
The problem with a rail disaster like that, it's knowing what to photograph. The importance is to get the injured out. That is the first thing. So you have to stand back and you have to leave the rescue services to do everything. But there is a lot of information that needs to be photographed before the cutting away is actually done, because it could be important. So you end up literally photographing everything and everything that's at the scene.
You've no idea what a train does when it gets smashed to smithereens. There's wheels that weigh a ton, they're upside down and all over the place. And you have to consciously say, now, I've got to do the damage and the apparent cause and the reasons, the signals and the lines and the impact of the trains and so on. And a couple of times I did the bits where the person had been trapped. I didn't photograph anyone actually trapped. But you're conscious, I was in that instance, that you were there while other people were trying to help other people not to die. So, and you were there extremely superfluous to requirements, but it had to be done.
It's very tempting to take the photographs that are newsworthy. In actual fact, it's exactly the opposite. You photograph, you have to use your own, use a lot of your own initiative on this, and you've found out normally from railway people what the basic story is, and you normally find out actually fairly quickly. It's amazing how much you can piece together very swiftly, and you simply use your own nous to go round and photograph everything that you think will be useful for an inquiry.
And the worst thing about photographing disasters is the knowledge that there is still worse to come.
The downside of a job like that is in fact, the post-mortems afterwards. You normally work in a team of 3 of you, because it's in the bodies are normally in a pretty poor state, and it's in Clapham we spent 3 days photographing bodies, piecing them together for the coroner's inquest.
When you think of some of the jobs that they had to cope with, they were excellent. But it's sort of jobs where you've got multiple bodies that, and particularly if you've been working for many hours, which of course it can happen, that you do notice that they are a little bit wound up. I did in fact get a bit of a rap from the Chief Medical Officer because I hadn't sent anybody for counselling. I said, well, nobody's actually asked me. And he says, you should recognise it and just send them, make them come, you know. But I think my staff felt that if they wanted to chat about it, they could just chat with their friends and talk about it there, because that to me is all counselling is. It's just being able to release the story to somebody else of what's happened, and that helps.
Since 1995, the Met has offered professional counselling to police and civilian staff. In Part 2, the bombs that brought years of terror to the capital. It's midnight, a road in South London, a crime scene.
Yeah, that's marked just there, is it?
I think so.
Yeah. I've seen the marks of...
Yeah, so there's a lot of scratches there.
A stolen car has slammed into a pedestrian.
Initially, what we're trying to do is to actually show the road as best as we can in the natural sort of lighting conditions as it would have been seen by the motorists and things. So we don't put any sort of flash on or artificial light on for the initial photographs. It's usually only when we're doing close-ups to show specific things or vehicles that we'll actually introduce some sort of flash techniques and things.
The driver is long gone. The victim fighting for life. Photographer Bob Campbell at work.
It's quite nice to be out in a relative fresh air. I had a whole day yesterday of dead bodies, so it's quite nice to be out here, really. Just doing another slightly closer picture of the area where the poor man that was run over ended up, just showing the blood and his shoe and a few other bits and pieces on the ground. Then the impact, one shoe has flown over the wall, and the wall must be about 9 foot high, mustn't it? It just shows you, what happens with so many things. And that's that for here. Off to find that burnt out car, I think.
Last year, the photographic branch was called out to the scene of some 1,200 road traffic accidents. A strong stomach is part of the job specification.
I always remember that when I was on the interview, the little fat chap, I don't know who he was a civil servant, I think, and he said to me, Mr. Cook, if you were to leave here today and you found a motorcyclist on one side of the road and his head on the other, what would you do? And I said, I'd be sick. And he laughed, and he said, yeah, but you've got to photograph it. I said, well, I'd be sick and then try and photograph it. But I don't know if they got me the job, but I think I hardened up over the years, and I really was... I used to be disgusted, but not revolted.
When it comes to double-deckers and low bridges, accident history tends to repeat itself.
I wouldn't say they're common, those sort of accidents, but they do happen from time to time. The height of the first bridge was high enough for the bus to go under, but the second bridge was slightly lower, and obviously he hadn't allowed for this. I think the bus was being used to transport school children. Unfortunately, no one was seriously injured on that one. I think the children actually saw the bridge coming and managed to duck just in time. They were lucky.
An hour after photographing the scene, Bob hears the car has been found. It looked like the work of teenage joyriders. They've tried to destroy the evidence of their involvement.
Basically, the people have dumped it here and tried to set a light to it and basically done a runner. So we're showing where it's been left, and in a minute we'll be doing some closer pictures to showing the damage to it.
Bob's job is to create a forensic record of the car to help the police investigation and provide the evidence for any eventual prosecution. Doing it in the dark calls for special technical ingenuity.
What we're actually doing is what we call open flash. It basically means that the camera shutter is open for a time exposure, and during that actual time we're actually firing off flash guns to actually light up bits of the actual scene at a time. Excuse me, I'll just start around. Depending on obviously the size of the scene and how much you need to light up, depends on how many flashes you actually use and where from, really.
They call the technique painting with light.
And that's it, we just close the shutter. Hopefully when it comes out it'll be nicely evenly lit.
What makes London attractive also makes it a magnet for crime, terror and disaster. It's the capital of leisure. This was the doomed pleasure ship, the Marchioness, where 51 people died. It's the capital of diversity. This is the aftermath of a bomb in multi-ethnic Brixton. And this, a second attack in Brick Lane, where many of the Asian population live. It's the capital of easygoing, tolerant, liberal lifestyle. This is the Admiral Duncan, a gay pub, the third target of a man condemned by inadequacy, consumed by hate. London, like any crowded capital, lives eternally with risk and tragedy unforeseen. Sandra Skipstead is one of the 10 women Met photographers. There's no discrimination in doling out the jobs, sensational or sordid, dramatic or dismally commonplace.
It was a raid, a drugs raid, and when the officers went in, one person tried to escape through the window and fell 4 floors and is in hospital. And that's it for that one.
Today's a routine assignment, a drugs bust on a South London council estate. Tomorrow could bring anything. That's the attraction, and for Sandra, the excitement of the job.
It sounds really bad, but, you want to go somewhere where there's a lot of people and, it's a cordon off and there's a tension there and you feel like, oh, it's almost like being in a film, really. Only real.
Sandra has to record the drugs paraphernalia and the window where one suspect made his unorthodox and painful exit. There are times, Sandra admits, when the pain of it all, especially at post-mortems, gets to her.
Probably the worst one was the PM of the children, because I went in unprepared, but that wasn't nice. They were in their pajamas and stuff. That was awful, actually. And then having to go back to the scene, I could have done without that. They'd been shot by a shotgun. So.
Who did it?
Daddy did it. It was also a lengthy one because obviously the whole family was dead. He had shot Mommy, the children, and himself. And I have a young sister who's only 10 years old, 11, 10. So, when you kind of think, oh my God, see this little face, and it's awful, actually. Then, recently I had another one as well. A little young girl had been beaten to death by her father. So, the PM I did of that. I think probably the children are the worst for some reason. I mean, it's bad for everyone, but I guess it depends what your own experience is, what you have in your life, what has the most influence on you, I think. flash guns.
Once-in-a-lifetime disasters that would scar all of us forever are their daily duty, terrible yet routine chore.
After a period of time, I think it's because saturation sort of builds in. You see so much of it. It's just another body. You just carry on and you do the job. And I think by the time I got to the Deptford fire, I'd gone through the sort of sort of caring, but into the sort of, it's another job. Let's get this job done and go off to the mortuary and do that, and then go off and do another job. And then, then you start to sort of get over it that way.
In 1981, there was a party at this house in southeast London. There were 50 guests. 14 of them died.
The house itself was totally burnt from top to bottom. It must have gone up very, very quickly, I should think. Whatever happened was supposed to have happened in the front, downstairs, left-hand room as you go in. But obviously as the stairs have been burning, obviously people haven't been able to escape or get out of the windows for some reason. One of the first floor rooms at the front, I think, had possibly 3 bodies in there, and all the rooms were quite severely burnt, and therefore obviously the bodies were quite badly burnt as well.
Intruding on tragedy, it's not easy to balance objectivity against natural emotion.
To photograph everything, you really have to start sort of stepping over people and things like that. It does become a bit sort of impersonal, really. That's the problem with those sort of things.
Certainly, it wasn't a job Morgan could simply walk away from after photographing the bodies.
I actually assisted the laboratory sergeant to wrap them up in their little polythene bags, ready to be taken away, because it seems to be a peculiarity. As soon as something like that happens, then all the willing hands tend to sort of disappear. And it's very unfair for the lab sergeant to, I always thought it was, and he had 11 to do anyway, and so I just got the gloves on and got stuck in with him, and we wrapped them up ready for taking away.
20 years on, the police are still treating the fire as a possible multiple murder, and the images are still printed on Morgan's memory.
One of the last photographs I took was the one in the back room at the top. There was just one individual in there, but whether they were shouting for help or trying to get out of the window, bearing in mind it would have been about the 4th floor, he just slumped over the windowsill, very, very badly burnt. And taking the photograph from the back of the house, you can actually sort of see him sort of highlighted against the sky, where there's no roof in the building at all.
London has never had an instant cataclysm like the terrible September the 11th, 2001 in New York. Instead, the capital's police have been on constant alert through decades of sustained but sporadic violence, mostly the work of the Provisional IRA or breakaway Republican groups. And when bombers hit London's financial centre, the human toll was mercifully light, just 1 fatality, 44 injured, here at Bishopsgate in 1993. The Canary Wharf bomb 3 years later killed 2 people and left many of the glass palaces of Docklands in splinters. It broke the IRA truce, a truce in a campaign which in the 80s had almost monopolised the work of the photographic squad.
We had a bomb standby. It meant sleeping in the yard, and if there was a murder, you didn't get a call. If there was a fatal accident, you didn't get a call. But if it was a bomb, you went. You sat and watched television or read a book or just went to bed and hoped that nobody would call.
Quite often you'd hear a sort of a boom, and you look out the window, this little pool of black smoke going up, so you think, right, who's next? Jump in a van, and we all sort of rushed off round there. And it was in the times of when, everybody sort of arrived at the scene at the time, and there was ambulances and fire brigade and goodness knows what, and people running around like headless chickens.
In December 1983, bombers struck at Harrods. 6 people were killed. At bomb scenes, there's always the risk of secondary devices.
As I pulled up about 50 yards from the scene, I opened the van door, one leg outside, and bang, this thing went off. And I very quickly sort of threw myself out and tried to roll underneath the van, but being somewhat on the large side, I didn't quite make it. But there was a few bits of debris sort of floating around in the air for a few minutes. and sort of brush myself down and start it all over again.
And the day no one who was there will ever forget. Hyde Park on an idyllic summer's day in 1982. The Queen's troop of the Household Cavalry was setting off from barracks to Buckingham Palace.
I was just coming back from scenes of crime somewhere on 3 District, which is east of London, and I'd got to somewhere like Blackfriars Bridge, and I heard over the air that there was an incident, a bomb had gone off in Hyde Park. Would I get there straight away? And of course I haired off down the embankment as fast as I could. When I got there, a colleague of mine was already working, and together we spent the next hour or so photographing everything we could find, from the blown up car to the poor horses which were laying all over the place. It was rather a macabre sight.
Well, we just saw carnage, really. The horses lying everywhere, and the insides of most of the horses were out, and legs were off, and it was fairly horrific. We didn't see any human beings around, but they had all gone before we got there, so we saw just the horses. It was a fairly traumatic scene.
But while we were working, just at that point, when we'd nearly finished, there was another explosion. Over the air came a message, would a photographer please get to Regent's Park, where another bomb had gone off. I thought, blimey, if this is 2 within an hour or so, if we get a third one, we're going to be really in serious trouble.
We shot off to Regent's Park, and that was really horrific, because the pieces of body were everywhere from bandsmen that had been blown up. And we were there, really, virtually nearly the first people there.
The terrorist had apparently put a bomb under the bandstand where the musicians were playing. But the bomb going off under the players had a devastating effect. And I think 7 were killed and a lot were injured. When you looked at it, you thought, people just don't do this. But this had been done by people to have an effect. And there were young people dead. And it was rather, sort of a bit of a shaker of a scene. So that was, a bit awkward.
It was just total devastation and carnage up there. It was a horrendous sight, because you had bodies and an extraordinary sort of macabre scene of dented and blood-stained instruments all scattered around. It was actually quite upsetting, that one.
Scenes of crime photographers are used to working in detail, in meticulous close-up. This time, the crime and the scene were just too big for that.
We took sample general photographs like we did with the horses, but just to show, in some cases, how awful it was, but not to focus too specifically on the gruesome side. But the thing I remember most from it is that people had been literally blown apart. That was not something I'd seen at that stage.
In 1991, the bombers struck deep at the heart of government itself. John Major was holding a cabinet meeting. It was a cold winter's morning. London was looking as pretty as a Christmas card. Across the other side of Whitehall, parked insolently outside the Ministry of Defence itself, missiles fired from a white van whistled over the rooftops to number 10.
Obviously, Downing Street itself has obviously been built up and the walls thickened and all sort of security things. But the mortars, I believe, one landed in the garden quite close to the wall and a couple in the park next door. As they exploded, obviously it sort of pushed the windows in and all the frames and everything else were loose, so all that sort of damage had to be photographed. And I think it was quite close to the sort of cabinet room near the basement or wherever it was.
At least one minister took shelter under a table. There was damage upstairs in the state rooms, and the private quarters, the small flat at the top of the house, didn't escape the shrapnel.
one of the other guys was out doing the sort of mortars in the park, and I was just concerned with the launch point, as it were, just sort of photographing the sort of van on the inside and the outside, photographing the sort of the structure of how it was sort of actually built, then waiting for the van to be removed, and then photographing the debris on the floor to be sort of sifted through for sort of odd bits of wire and other things. To finish off the day, really, it was just a couple of sort of long general shots looking back down from the north down to number 10 itself, which by that time was about 4 inches deep in snow.
After the break, pictures never seen before reveal the true story of the King's Cross underground disaster.
My biggest disaster, if you like, was at Ronan Point, which was a series of flats over in West Ham. And a chap converted a woman's electric cooker to gas. And he used the ducting for the junctions that the electrics, that were already dug into the wall. And he'd done such a bad job of it that she came out, she lived on the 18th floor, and she came out early in the morning to have a cup of tea, lit the gas, and the whole side of the house came out. But of course, the way it was built, one of these system built, the built in sort of sections, it went down like a pack of cards, and 18 floors down went. I arrived there, and I thought this was going to be a colossal job. I got up to the 18th floor, and they said to me, "We want you to go out to the kitchen." And you opened the flat door, and there was no corridor. It went down 18 floors, and there was just sticking out from the wall, there was just the sort of remnants of the floor of the hall. So they said, "We want you to go out there, climb round, and take some photographs of the what's name." And I said, "You must be joking." And before I could say anything, they were plastering me with ropes. They'd done ropes everywhere going round me, you see. And they had 6 coppers on the end of this rope. And they said, "Right, we'll save you, don't worry, you go out." So I literally crawled along this little ledge, and I got my hand on the door, and I got round, and then they got a plank, and they passed all my bits of equipment one by one through over to the kitchen. And I was photographing there to show the marks on the walls from the blast and things. And suddenly somebody set off an oxyacetylene torch on the ground, and it sounded just like concrete breaking. And I passed those 6 coppers, still straining on this rope, in about 10 seconds. I mean, it must have taken me 20 minutes to get out there. It took me 10 seconds to get back. And I said to them, "Can't you hear the concrete breaking?" And they all fell about laughing because they knew what it was, But that was a heck of a job, because every time they found a body, and they found 5 of them, I had to go down to the ground with all the kit again and photograph the body. And I always remember some workman on the top of a hut saying, "Look at that ghoul photographing the bloody things," But at least I was there for a purpose. He was there just to gawk. But I took 130 photographs inside the building and about another 40 photographs at the post-mortems, because they couldn't work out which bit went with which. They were finding bits of body rather than whole body,
A summer's day this year at the Biggin Hill Air Show is to mean more grim work for the photographic squad. It's Saturday, and tragedy has struck. In the course of a proud display of aviation technology, ancient and modern, a vintage de Havilland Vampire trainer jet has ploughed into the ground near the airfield. Bob Campbell, himself an amateur pilot, is called to the scene.
Okay, right, I'll stop here, I think. Let's just get a shot from here for a kick-off.
Bob liaises with the air accident investigator. Although he knows his way round Biggin Hill, this is his home airfield.
Aircraft is hit in some manner, fairly much like that.
Yeah.
This is actually the mark that's been made by a wing
right
impacting the ground.
Yeah.
Then you've got the main bit of
body and impact.
Body and so on and fuselage there in the impact.
Got it, right, okay, thanks very much. There we go, right. Whew. Right, well this is just really an establishing sort of photograph really of the actual the main scene of the crash. Unfortunately it does look as if the whole thing's pretty well disintegrated, isn't it really? Dear, dear, like I say, you hardly really know it was an airplane, would you really, if someone told you?
In the wreckage, the dismembered remains of 2 bodies.
I think I'm just immune to it. I think a lot of us, most of us are, the police photographers are. I think if you let it bother you, you wouldn't be doing the job. If you let sights bother you, I think it's circumstances that bother you rather than sights.
Bob, too, reserves his sentiment for the ruined aeroplane.
It's poignant. Gives you an idea what a lovely aeroplane it was once. Apparently, this aircraft's a 1950s vintage wooden mainly wood and engine, so it certainly is going to explode. And when it hits the ground, and the poor devils that are in it, obviously wouldn't know much about it, really. If I can see me first bits of human remains down there, is that right?
You have a defence mechanism which you normally employ when you're photographing things because you're interested in getting them sharp, well lit. There are other people who are going to follow you, the forensic officer, fingerprint officer. Everybody's waiting to get at what you're doing. So although you're recording it probably first, it gets through to you in odd bits and pieces, and you have to compartmentise it if you can.
The show, it seems, must go on. Though unknown to Bob, things are about to take another terrible turn.
My children ask me sometimes about things, but I don't really tell them very much. I just sort of tell them in sort of fairly sort of vague, sort of broad terms. I don't discuss work an awful lot at home.
Today, as we'll see, Bob will be back home a lot later than he'd planned.
Oh, the car crashes, you do thousands. Train crashes, not quite so many. Probably King's Cross might have been the nastiest one. That was certainly very demanding. I think we were at that scene for 3 or 4 days at least.
King's Cross revealed the true rickety state of the capital's transport infrastructure. One early November evening in 1987, 31 people died in a fireball which exploded up the escalators and into the ticket hall.
It didn't do any bodies because there weren't any bodies at 6 o'clock in the morning. I think most of the people that had died or were injured had been moved away, so it was basically the scene to do.
The disaster stretched the resources and the emotions of the photographic squad.
I spent about a day and a half there, I think, in all from memory. It was quite a strenuous scene to photograph. There was lots of smoke damage and fire damage in a confined area, especially in the ticket hall and going up the escalator.
This was the result of a combination of wooden structures, grease, and the lack of a no-smoking policy on the underground.
We had to spend quite a bit of time underneath the escalator to photograph the damage to the mechanism. I can remember it being a very confined area, almost having to walk sideways down the escalator. It was quite claustrophobic. There was no lights, apart from the lights on our cameras. I was almost ready to pass out by the time I'd finished that. It was so hot and smoky.
I had to photograph the detritus, the grease and the cigarette ends and the matches, everything else that was under there, which to me indicated possibly the cause of the fire, or the reason for the fire. In other words, something had got hot and all this muck had gone up, whoosh, and that was it. But I can't possibly say what the cause of the fire was, but that's how it appeared to me.
These pictures were to prove vital in establishing how the fire started and the dreadful dynamic that turned a spark into a firestorm.
After the scene had been completed, I had the privilege, if you can say that, of attending the St Pancras mortuary, where all the bodies had been taken to. I can remember that day. St Pancras mortuary isn't a very nice place on a good day, let alone with 30 bodies all over the floor, waiting to be post-mortem and taken away. I had my back up against the wall while they wheeled bodies out. There was just no room at all. Looking back on it, the worst 3 or 4 days, one of the worst 3 or 4 days in my career in the Met Police.
There's an average of 2 post-mortems every day for the Met's photographic squad. This one is in northeast London. there's been a fatal shooting. Over the next 5 hours, Lee Plumridge will be documenting the intimate evidence of how the victim died.
The best way to get through it is not to think of them necessarily as the individuals that they were, but or just as another job.
There was two things that struck me the first time I went to a post-mortem. One was the light, because everything in a post-mortem room is white, and it reflects, and there's plenty of lights, and everything reflects white. But the smell hits you, and I've got a feeling it's psychological, because it's a human smell. It's a disgusting smell, but it's a human smell.
You get used to that diagnostic smell, which is easily described, I suppose, as bad meat and disinfectant. It's a most peculiar mix, and once you've smelt it, you can go anywhere in the world, and if you smell that smell, you'll know that it's got to do with death.
An ordinary post-mortem tries to answer the question of what caused the death. This time it's obvious. Who caused the killing is the question for the police who cluster round the cold mortuary slab. The bullet's unique rifling pattern may prove critical.
Most cases where you would do it either a suspicious death or a murder, you've got to photograph the body full length, front and back, clothed, to show what they had on, and there might be holes in the clothing where a person's been shot or stabbed or whatever. Then you've got to do the same thing unclothed, unwashed. In other words, the blood as it is, dry or whatever. So you do the body full length, front and back, and any other injuries that are required. Then the body is put up on the slab, because you're doing this on the floor, because to get a 5 or 6 foot person in on a 5.4 camera, you've got to be up fairly high, even with a wide angle lens if you have to use it. So having done all those shots, the body is now put on the mortuary slab, washed off, and then you would photograph any injuries that now show themselves plainly. You would have to photograph them with a scale. Having done that, then the pathologist would open up the body, take out whatever organs were in the way of, say a person had been stabbed through the heart. Well, you can't often see that with all the lungs or perhaps the chest cavities full of blood. So that would have to be washed out, and then you could see the injury. So really, all you're doing is photographing things.
Sunday at Biggin Hill, and the air pageant continues even as Bob Campbell gathers the evidence of the previous day's air crash. Then, in front of an appalled crowd of 35,000 spectators and captured on video, another tragedy is played out in the sky. An American king cobra fighter tumbles from the sky, hits the ground and blossoms into flame.
While we were on the other side, over towards this direction, we saw a sort of load of flames and smoke coming up, and we actually dismissed it. We didn't actually think it was another crash. We thought it might be some sort of pyrotechnics they were letting off on a runway, which they do some years for special effects, you know. and lo and behold, it wasn't long before we realised it was another crash, and sadly another vintage aircraft that has gone down, another pilot's been killed. So it's been a hectic weekend, and busy for everybody.
Jackie Bishop, another of the branch's photographers, has had another weekend interrupted.
Apparently it's come down nose first, but obviously that's all to be sorted out later on exactly what did happen. But it's fairly contained, the scene, so it leads you to believe that it hasn't sort of skidded around or anything like that. It's come pretty much straight down.
Senior photographic officer Chris Batt has come with video support. 2 planes, 2 incidents, 2 separate specific investigations.
That's what happens in all these major disasters. You know, everyone tends to muck in, you know, and people that are doing other things will have to drop them and leave them for a few days and get on to the important task in hand.
So at the moment, I think they're going to close the scene tonight and come back tomorrow morning to finish it off, because we're losing the light now. But yeah, they'll search the scene thoroughly, and they want to make sure, obviously, that it wasn't engine failure or whatever, and recover all the bits.
In part 4, crawling through the wreckage of Paddington. Photographers in search of the truth about the crash. At the squad's discreet South London headquarters, Bob Campbell is sorting through the negatives of the air crash. The evidence at the scene is scattered. It needs to be methodically reconstructed.
What actually happens is all these things are given two numbers. One number is actually put in with the actual bit of body and actually literally put in a bag, and the other number is actually pinned to the ground, so it's actually marked the spot where that piece came from. And at the same time as me going around, later on they have a couple of chaps going down from our technical support thing. They've got a GPS mobile satellite system, and they're actually able to plot on this exactly where all these bits are. So he'll be able to say exactly where every single piece of the body's landed.
It's almost a definition of the police photographer's job, carefully recording the factual disarray and then reassembling it into the objective truth, making order out of the tragic chaos.
They have to be sorted out in the sequence that they were taken, and also for each day. So you can imagine 4 different days, and when you're looking at these small body parts, they all tend to look the same, really. So it's a bit of a task to actually sort them all out. Once you've seen lots of these things, you just get used to it, I'm afraid. You can hardly relate to being human beings anyway, because they're just small bits of meat almost, really, and bone. "11 years after Clapham, Paddington. The trains are faster, the devastation more horrifying."
We were at Hammersmith Police Station. I believe we had a phone call from the Notting Hill office, just saying tune into their police radio channel. Basically, you just heard what was going on the PR channels. Police officers who were at the scene describing to the control room what's going on, what help is needed. You know, it was like, you know, call everybody, get fire brigade. People saying just numerous walking wounded. You know, they couldn't even put a figure on it. You know, it's like potentially hundreds. Sounded mayhem over the PR.
31 people, 4 fewer than at Clapham, actually perished. But the number and severity of the injuries were far worse.
My first impression was like, it's like a film set. You used to see a train at a certain angle, you know, upright in the top 6 feet, but when you see the seats and things like that lying about, ripped open and stuff, blood-stained and so on, it's, I mean, the actual sight itself, which take away from the fact that it was a train crash, it's something that all of us are used to, a crash, bodies, but it's just the scale of it. When you put 2 trains together and 30 bodies, and it's all there in one go, it tends to hit home a little harder than the average fatal road accident that we'd attend.
In many accidents, searching for clues about how the accident happened, any mechanical or structural flaw, is the first priority. This time the cause was all too obvious. The principal task was to identify who was on that fatal train as it neared journey's end at Paddington.
We were just preparing, getting ready for the first bodies to start coming in, and then it was absolute pandemonium. On the first day there was 17 bodies brought in, so we had those split between the 2 of us. They'd bring a body bag in, which had come from the scene. You'd photograph the contents of the bag with the number, the individual label, front and back of the body. The body would be taken out, any clothes would be taken off, washed down a little bit, and then repeat the procedure front and back again, and hopefully try and get an identification. Where it was possible, we were photographing identifiable features, tattoos, jewellery, certainly wedding rings, because obviously partners have bought them so that they'd be able to recognise them. I remember being not upset, but being something sticking on my mind. One of the bodies that I photographed, I had to photograph a tattoo which had his name on it, and I remember seeing his family at the inquest, well, not on the television after the inquest. That just stuck in my mind. Just the surname, because I didn't know any other surnames at that point, but the surname that I got from the tattoo, and then seeing his mother and father, you know, it's something that sticks in your mind. But apart from that, you don't really get involved too much, you know.
At times like this, the methodical nature of the task, the systematic procedures, the routine precision mercifully take over. After all, you need to be steady to stay in focus.
Well, we worked as a pair with one body recovery team. So it was basically they were doing searching of the scene. Anything that they found, they would point out to us. Dave would use the video to locate these numbers. Then I would come in and do stills. Then the recovery team would actually, the officer who would be labelling or exhibiting, if you want, the remains that had been identified.
There was one of the carriages which we wouldn't go in, I think until about 4 or 5 days after the, it was about 4 days after the crash, because they couldn't stabilise the carriage. It was on its side at an angle. They had to build scaffolding around it before we could actually go in it. And I think that was the worst, which was burnt out of the carriages.
The inspector said to us, if you feel like laughing, feel like joking, go ahead and laugh and joke. If anybody criticises you for it, then they're the ones that are out of order. Because no way can you do that job without having a joke. You know, if you took it as seriously as the job was, then you wouldn't be able to function. It's the gallows humour. Yeah, certainly. And I think it's necessary when you're doing a job like that to at least try and make, you know, it's not saying have as much fun as you can, but you try and make light of the situation for your own benefit. You have to, I think. You have to. Anything.
The job isn't always over when the last picture has been taken. Some photographers are still haunted by the memory of what they've seen.
Yeah, I don't want to really go and train them much myself. Especially as, you know, since then there's been a couple of other incidents. It just, not to say it frightened me, just, you know, wasn't very pleasant, that's all. I mean, I've been through the site myself several times on the train, because going back home to visit family in Wales, that you actually go through on that particular stretch of line, and it's very, very eerie.
In the 100 years since the Met began to photograph scenes of crime and disaster, the lesson has been well learnt. You survive the horror by treating it as a job and getting on with it. But everyone, however professional, is touched by tragedy. And it's toughest for the photographer. He's the only one who can never look away.